So how many of the terms under situational and dispositional here did you come up with? Environmental, personality, maybe the phrase just the way he or she or they is. They is a gender neutral term. Did you use the word internal or external? Or maybe the word temporary? For each one of these, decide if it's situational or dispositional. And when you're done with that, please consider the 3 examples listed below and decide, is that example suggesting a situational or dispositional explanation? So environmental, that would be a situational aspect. Personality, that's stable, that's dispositional. Just the way the person is, well, that's their temperament, their disposition. Internal, well, that's dispositional. External, situational. And temporary, well, that's clearly situational. Now, in terms of our 3 examples, you apologize for being snippy and just say, I just failed my test. Well, clearly you're implying that you're not normally a snippy person. You're just snippy because of the situation. So that would be a situational influence. Perhaps you say about somebody, he or she or they, so nice. Every time I talk, so friendly. So apparently this person has a sunny disposition. Third example, pretend it's you complaining about a colleague at work, and you are complaining. He is so irresponsible. He is late more than he's on time if he bothers to show at all. So my boss asked me to cover for him yet again. So your colleague, your male colleague, is he, are you referring to his situation or disposition? Clearly disposition. It's not that he was late one time with a flat tire or a tie-up on 890. No, apparently it is dispositional, his stable, his typical way of acting. How did you do on these? Hopefully well. Let's next consider 3 foundational studies in social psychology exploring the role of personality and environment. So continuation of our topic. First study, Ash studies, performed by Solomon Ash on the topic of conformity. Stanley Milgram's famous studies on obedience. And Phil Zimbardo's famous study on situational power. You might remember Phil Zimbardo as the host of our series. Let's start with our first classic psychology experiment performed by one Solomon Ash. The topic, conformity. Let's define it as engaging in behaviors due to social norms. For an example, let's consider the one I usually use in class, that of a male student wearing a white wedding dress on the day of Halloween. Now, any bride's allowed to wear a white wedding dress, and anybody can wear a white wedding dress on Halloween. So if we see him, we'd probably smile at him and think he enjoys this particular holiday. If we see them on the day after Halloween, still wearing the white wedding dress, we'll think he had quite the holiday. But if he continues to come to class day after day wearing the same white wedding dress, you're probably going to start to feel very uncomfortable, and I would probably try to engage him in a quiet after-class conversation and see if I can talk him into coming down to visit Mrs. King with me, our wonderful college counselor. Certainly he's allowed to wear a white wedding dress, but wearing it day after day is certainly a violation of conformity. He is violating social norms. Please visit the link shown, and I think you'll enjoy this little short clip on conformity. Afterwards, please return to the PowerPoint and we'll continue. Please access the link below and jump to the point of time, 7 minutes and 5 seconds. You'll see a clip there which shows the picture shown on this slide. I'm going to ask you to listen to this clip maybe several times and put the study into your notes. This is what I would do in class, and I would have in class the students talk to each other to confirm their answers. Unfortunately, we don't have this possibility now, but you have at your hands the repeat play of this little clip. So in your notes, please put the methodology, in other words, how the study was very specifically conducted and what it very specifically found, and that should be a percentage. You can stop viewing the clip when it starts to discuss the famous obedience study by Stanley Milgram. That will be our next slide. For these 3 golden and oldie studies, be sure to actually go to the website and, as requested, include the methodology and the specific results. you will find a multiple point question, and not just 2 or 3 points, but a significant multiple point question on your final exam, asking you to do just such. More detail, better than less, so you really can't give me too much detail. It's quite common students will give me too little detail. So good. Again, consider this to be a practice for your final. Let's consider an interesting variation Solomon Asch did on his basic study design. In one study, he had one individual before a real subject give a different answer. For a study that was supposedly on visual acuity, this particular subject was not a good subject. He had very thick eyeglasses and commented that he really couldn't see very well, and then he gave a different answer as compared to the rest of the group, that is, compared to the rest of the Confederates. When it got to the real subject, did that one subject before him giving a different answer than the group have much an effect? Well, the conformity rate dropped from the typical 70% down to astounding 10%. So what can we walk away with? Well, often when a group is making a wrong decision, each individual member thinks it's a bad decision, but is afraid to voice their dissent. It might be a group project, it might be something going on at your job, it might be a family decision, but if one person voices a contrary position to the rest of the group, it frees the rest of the group to give their honest opinion too. Maybe sometime you'll be that dissenting voice. Let's continue with our exploration of these 3 classic social psychology experiments. Our next topic is obedience. The famous theorist, one Stanley Milgram. Many of you have already seen part or all of this particular study. Its focus, as I mentioned, was obedience. Obedience is following the orders of an authority figure. Take a moment and think of the various authority figures in our lives. So perhaps you said parents, your boss, maybe your doctor when he or she says that you should maybe stop smoking, especially in COVID times. That'd be good advice. It might be the police officer who motions you to pull over, and so on, maybe even a teacher. Next, please go to the video clip that you see the link for. It's where you were before, and start it at 8 minutes and 2 seconds. And you'll see clips from the study shown on the slide, the picture below. Continue to watch this particular clip until Phil Zimbardo starts to talk about the fundamental attribution error. At this point, you can stop the video clip and write down the methodology, in other words, specifically how the study was conducted. Again, detail is good, and what was found, including the percentage. Expect to see on your next test, the final, a short answer question in which you will have to do all this, and lack of detail would definitely work against you, so don't be shy. Include a lot of detail. So the Milgram obedience studies are the most famous and perhaps the most infamous experiments ever conducted in social psychology. But why was this experiment considered to be so controversial? Well, let's look in terms of psychology's ethical guidelines and let that help guide us. Though, let me share one of the more common responses. They shock people. Okay, then which of the psychology's ethical standards would that relate to? Protection from harm. The problem is that, as many of you are thinking right now, there was no shock given. The person that was yelping and complaining was an actor, and kind of a bad one at that. So clearly it wasn't the electric shocks that didn't occur. So now we've got that kind of one out of the way, let's look at the other ones step by step. The IRB must approve it. Well, as you know, there was no mention of lack of IRB. It was run through the IRB the same way every other study is run through the IRB. So it's not the first one. Confidentiality, they shared the names with the subject. No, that didn't occur. Wasn't mentioned in the video clip either. Debriefing must happen if deception is used. I get quite a lot of students say, it's deception is used. There's no problem with deception. If you use deception, you must debrief. And they did, in fact, debrief afterwards. So that wasn't the issue either. Informed consent, the components. Well, what were they? Let's see. You have to be told as much as possible about the study, which is typically not a lot, so that wasn't a problem. You must be informed that you have the right to refuse to participate. That wasn't a problem either. But the third one, that's where we get into a sticky situation. They have to be informed that they must feel free to drop out of the experiment. They can withdraw from the experiment at any time. And there was a certain degree of coercion. So when when the subjects started the protest, they would often say, "You agreed to continue, you must continue," and things like that. So it did partially violate one of the features of informed consent, that the subject must feel free to leave the experiment at any time. But the big issue was the last one. So these subjects, if you watch them, there are full-length footages available on the internet. They look like they're about ready to have a heart attack. They're running their fingers through their hair and they're pulling on their ties, and they look like they're about ready to have a heart attack. It's a very stressful situation. So in part, protection from harm would include psychological stress. Now, what was the level of psychological stress? Well, they did do follow-ups of these gentlemen for many years. Nobody suffered from PTSD. Nobody sued. In fact, many were very grateful to be in the study because they learned something about themselves. They didn't know that they were capable of this sort of behavior, and they said now they knew that they were capable of it, they would ensure it would never occur in real life. So possibly it's partially a violation of the protection of harm due to the extreme stress, but I think more so the risk is in the too much risk, too much potential for harm. It could have gone the other way. They could have had PTSD. So in terms of protection from harm, they did not know. It could have easily resulted in psychological harm. It didn't, but it could have. So the degree of risk is unacceptable. And during the experiment, the degree of psychological stress that you imposed, or Stanley Milgram imposed on the subjects, was at an unacceptable level. So for these reasons, Milgram's obedience study is often considered to be the most ethically challenged of all psychology experiments. I did fail to add one very important detail under protection from harm. Surprisingly, if you read the original experiment, and I did, and few teachers do, and few students do, amazingly, the degree of stress was so high that 3 different subjects went into epileptic seizures. Mind-boggling, yes? I can see after one they were surprised, but when it happened to the second subject, they should have stopped the study clearly, and they didn't. So having a seizure could be a dangerous event, so they clearly dropped the ball in the physical protection from harm. As I mentioned, many psychology teachers will indicate that Milgram is probably the least ethical psychology experiment. Again, I do not agree. Let's look at this particular picture. Do you recognize him? Probably not. I'm older than most of you. Who is he? He was the Unabomber, a mathematics college teacher who had a political manifesto. The individual probably suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. In any case, he sent bombs through the mail, killing several people. How does this relate to us locally? Well, his brother lived in Schenectady and read the manifesto that was published in a newspaper, realized that it was his brother, and turned him into the FBI. So that's our local ties. How does it relate to our course? Well, the Unabomber, one Theodore Kaczynski, was in a psychology experiment designed to break people. And I would argue if it was not for this probable experiment on how to break people, and he was one of the people that they experimented on, perhaps he would have never been the Unabomber. We can't say, but certainly it is compelling, to say the least, that he was in such an experiment before he started murdering people for political reasons. Let's continue to look at the role of situation on our behaviors. We're going to look at the classic Stanford prison experiment performed by one Phil Zimbardo. Now, I'm sure some of you, as you watch these 3 studies on the internet, are not convinced that they would generalize to the real world. Well, I want to assure you that this information does apply to real-life settings. Please go to the web link on the slide. I will warn you, it has nudity, and it should, if you're a normal human being, I hope find it somewhat upsetting. Watch it until you see the clip in which the gentleman is standing on the chair with a bag on his head with his hands out. That point you can stop viewing. If you're interested and you want to watch the whole slide, by all means, but that's the point you only need to watch until. Let's consider the concept of de-individuation. So you hopefully just saw the clip on the Abu Ghraib prison. Not an experiment, but an actual prison. And what was surprising was the perpetrators of the ill deeds were Americans. Why did these guards act the way they acted, and why did the students in the Zimbardo prison experiment do what they did? Well, in both examples, de-individuation was in control of the situation. This is a state in which the person has less self-awareness and a very strongly reduced sense of individuality. Their group identity takes over. Sometimes you hear the phrase mob mentality. The person's behaviors are no longer reflecting their own standards, but rather this new group identity, this new mob mentality. So be aware of this. This can happen to anybody. We can never think of ourselves as being an exception. That wouldn't happen to us, couldn't happen to us. Remember the forces that influence our behaviors. One of the 5 major pillars of all SUNY institutions is DEI. You've probably heard the acronym, but may or may not know what it stands for. Take a moment and see if you do. D is diversity. E is, you might want to say equality, but it's a very different concept. Equity. So equity and inclusion. Meaning that in SUNY and at our college, we believe that people of different backgrounds give us strength, give us knowledge, give us a better view of the world, improve us. Equity is not meaning treating everybody equally. It means giving people the tools that they need to survive. So maybe that young man pictured in the wheelchair doesn't benefit from stairs. Maybe he benefits from a lift or an elevator that's properly placed, or a tilted floor with a smooth surface that goes over stairs. So giving everybody the same stairs is not equality. Giving what they need is equity. And inclusion means everybody belongs, everybody's valued. A similar term, in the same wheel well anyway, is BIPOC. Take a moment and see if you know those letters. It stands for Black, Indigenous, in other words, Native peoples, and P for people of color. You might say black and color is not repeated. Not everybody that is a person of color is black. I assume that you know that too. It's highly unfortunate that prejudice and discrimination are as American as apple pie. In the current cultural environment, as I'm speaking, it is in the day of the election in November of 2020. There are powers in government that believe that our history should not be taught, and then if you want to teach all aspects of our history, then it's un-American. Obviously, I don't agree to this particular viewpoint. In our country, prejudice and discrimination have been faced by almost every immigrant group past the first Americans, the first English settlers, and some groups today no longer face that particular discrimination. For example, consider the no Irish need to apply. Back Civil War times, slightly after, and definitely before, the Irish faced huge discrimination. They were not given employment, they were not given housing, rampant discrimination. And yet now Irish Americans are the bedrock of our culture. One of the many groups in certain areas, such as in New York City, fire departments and police departments, very strongly represented or overrepresented, though not negatively. Other groups still face discrimination. Consider the quote by General Sheridan. As you probably know, the American government at various points engaged in genocidal policy resulting in the deaths of millions and millions of Native Americans, including the purposeful infection of blankets that we were given. You're probably familiar with the Trail of Tears and how so many Native Americans perished on that particular journey. But there are many, many attacks by the American government on Native American settlements that were not at war with the U.S., sneak attacks that often killed virtually every person or nearly every person in the attack. So again, our history of our government is not only anti-Black, it's also virtually, in many circumstances, anti-anybody that is not Caucasian. Consider the next one. You might be aware of the Chinese prejudice and discrimination that went on from the LaPierre study. This is a flyer that was posted that was celebrating the act that excluded Chinese immigrants or Chinese people from being immigrants to our country. And the last slide represents the most current continued discrimination being faced by African Americans. In this particular instance, protests related to George Floyd's murder. And so you can see this unfortunate characteristic of our society, the stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination, is not a new feature, but needs to be understood to understand where we are today, and hopefully to someday move beyond it. I hope I didn't ramble too much. If I did, I apologize, but I feel strongly on this. I'll be using the term isms in this area of the particular chapter: racism, sexism, and not every ism attaches nicely to the word that it's associated with, but the concept that people are treated differently because of their demographics, their born in or sometimes chosen group membership. So look at the Hydra, ageism, treating people either very young or very old as lacking. Ableism, differential treatment of people that have different physical, mental, or intellectual, emotional build, if you want to call it that. Class privilege. Hetero or cisnormity, believing that everybody is heterosexual and everybody is in a male-female partnered relationship. Colonialism or paternalism, the idea that one nation has the right to act as a benign parent to another nation, which usually is not very benign at all if you consider how many tens of millions of people were, for example, killed in Congo by the Belgian government during the colonization period. Race or ethnicity, that's probably pretty obvious. And patriarchy, that women need to be taken care of by men, unable to make decisions, and indeed shouldn't even have control of their own bodies, which is currently the case as I narrate this in April of 2025. This chapter focuses on three forms of intergroup bias, related and yet independent and distinct. First, stereotype. It's a belief that certain qualities are usually present in a certain group. So if you're a member of that group, you have that quality. These can be good qualities or bad qualities that might make you think that the person might benefit from a stereotype that's a good stereotype. Not necessarily. That can be highly variable and could clearly work against the group member under certain circumstances. For example, consider the image on the right, a stereotype that Asians as a group excel in academics. So what if you're an Asian American who's average or maybe below average? So you are not meeting not only perhaps your personal expectations, hard to say, but you're also violating the expectations we have for that group, and you might be treated more harshly than if you were a Caucasian American or an African American. Let's consider prejudice. I think of it as an emotion or a thought that is usually negative, but again, not always. So it can be thought or emotion. My definition uses an emotion-based attitude toward a particular group. Discrimination is when you put your prejudice into action. Discrimination is a behavior. So prejudice, either thought and or feeling. Discrimination, behavioral. Unfair treatment of people based on their group membership. So three basic terms are foundation to start with. Next slide, we'll look at this topic from a historical perspective in this country. The Americans that are very anti-immigrants seem to have forgotten the fact that we are a country that was built on the labor of immigrants, both voluntary as shown on the left, and the enslaved people as shown on the right. Don't forget that unless you are Native American, you are descended from immigrants. Maybe your grandparents, maybe your great-grandparents, but unless we are Native Americans, we are all descended from immigrants. So why do we use stereotypes, and when are we most likely to use them? Well, stereotypes are like heuristics. They're shortcuts. They make life easier. Easy, quick thinking. So we are more likely to use them when we're tired, when we're stressed, or even at low energy points of the day. Consider the picture on the right. Who's the librarian? Most people will choose, after viewing it for a short time, the woman on the left because of the bun hair. This is the most common outcome. But perhaps you just picked who you saw first. Well, if you did that, you're using the availability heuristic. Or maybe you know a librarian. Perhaps the person in the middle with their funky style might match a librarian that you know personally. But in general, most subjects when tested would go for the image on the left using our stereotype of a librarian. Modern racism is expressed in overt as well as more subtle ways. Consider the study. Students are asked to shock a subject. Typically, they will give black subjects a smaller shock than they would give to white subjects. But when the subject being shocked is actually a Confederate and asked to purposely annoy the person giving the shock, they will receive a higher shock than will a Caucasian Confederate. And it's reasonable to assume that the people given the shock had no idea that they would actually shock an annoying black subject, an annoying black person more than they would a white person. They chances are would feel that they are not a prejudiced person. Research indicates otherwise. So people who engage in isms, including racism and sexism and heteronormativity-ism, you really can't put ism on that, often do not know they're doing it. They think that they're a modern, unprejudiced person. But they still can act in harmful ways. What we're talking about is implicit bias. It's unconscious, you're not aware of it, in other words, harmful thoughts or feelings, ideas about a particular group that will impact your behaviors. For example, I assume that most doctors are not racist, and yet if you look at the prescription of medication, it's very much by race. Children of color are more likely to get the old generation ADHD meds than the newer. People that are given schizophrenia drugs, if they're a person of color, get the older drugs, typically, not the newer. People in situations where they need pain control, such as injury, post-surgery, people of color often get much lower doses because of the implicit bias of people in the medical profession. And this is not limited, of course, to the medical profession. We all hold implicit biases, every single one of us. So if you want to try to figure out what your particular implicit biases are, there's a bonus opportunity tied to the slide. You can see that there's a link. It's for the Harvard implicit bias test. There's probably about 20 of them or so. If you would like to do one for extra credit, and obviously you can do as many as you want, but if you want to do one for extra credit, send me the results, and I won't think any less of you if it's you learn that you have a bias. You do have to sign up because they will actually use your results as part of their ongoing study, so it's safe to sign up for. You will not get affected negatively in any way other than contributing to science, which I assume is a good thing. A new concept for some Americans is the concept of systemic racism. Recently, President Trump has tried to block the discussion of systemic racism in educational institutions and believe the acknowledgement of it is fundamentally anti-American. Anyway, racism, in terms of systemic racism, is not one person against another person. It is by entities such as business or government being perpetuated against the individual because of their group membership. And this is at the heart of the Black Lives Matter movement.
The isms, most definitely racism, are not only performed consciously or unconsciously by individuals, they're often done intentionally by institutions, and in that circumstance, we use the term systemic or systematic racism. And who gets hired, who gets promoted, salaries. I had a friend that for years got the trained incoming young men to be her boss every year, and she was a professional. Housing and bank loans. The next slide will concern this one. Education, environment and health. Usually the railroad tracks go near the poor section of town. The dirty, polluting, toxic industries, they don't go into Loudonville, they go into poorer areas. Legal protection and criminal convictions. So very much tailored to the person's demographics in terms of all these. So many people, when they consider slavery, consider it to be a horrific, at least I hope they consider it to be a horrific institution that occurred and ended a long time ago. But racism did not die in 1865 when slavery was legally abolished. And do remember that New York and all these states, or actually colonies at that point, were slave-holding institutions. The local Mabee Farm is a historical part of the Historic Society and was a slave-holding site. History lives with us today. It has not ended just because a certain decade in history has ended. Let's consider the idea of covenants. Think for a moment and see if you know what a covenant is. One of the best ways for families to pass on wealth is to buy a house. It's equity, so they can get loans, they can move up in the world. When the parents die, often it's passed to children or assisted grandchildren. So it's a path to the American dream. And yet, in virtually every state, there have been covenants which legally required the person, in some areas, not to sell to a person of color. It was illegal. If you did that, the proceeds from your sale would be seized. And other people did it voluntarily. They just didn't want their house to pass into the hands of somebody of a different race. You might say, isn't that ancient history? I don't consider myself to be ancient. Covenants were illegal in New York State when I was a child. So this lack of the ability to create wealth has impacted people of my students' age because they are the grandchildren of, if you're older, maybe the children of these individuals. So just one specific example here of many, 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 where the past continues to impact people in the present. Let's consider the concept of privilege. It's benefits that are accorded to you because of certain statuses you possess, many of them which you're born with. I will say that everybody has certain privileges. Some people have a lot more than others. The privilege comes with them when they just walk in the room and gives them access to things that other people don't get when they walk into that same room. Let's consider intersectionality, a concept coined by lawyer and DEI activist and theorist Kimberly Crenshaw. I had the privilege of being in the audience when she spoke. I didn't realize at the time how big and important she was, but now I value it all the more. So she has this concept of intersectionality, widely recognized, that different privileges intersect. So, for example, let's say a woman of color is different than being a woman or a person of color. And you might say obvious, but maybe not so obvious. Consider a case when a woman of color noticed that there were no women of color in the power structure of the huge corporation she worked in, and she sued, and she lost. They said that because there's people of color there and people of women there, people that are women, that was covered. And she said, no, it's not. And I agree with her. No, it's not. So your privileges interact based on your lack of privilege interact.
All of us are the member of many groups, and some of these groups may have privilege. So take a moment and consider the groups that you're in and which, if any, have privilege, enjoy privilege over other groups in our society. Actually, go ahead and do it. So most members of this class are white, but not all. So if you're white, you do enjoy white privilege. Some of the members of this class are male. They would enjoy male privilege. If you're heterosexual, you would enjoy that privilege. One student, when I taught virtually, suggested that he was good looking, and we learned that good looking people have their privilege associated with the halo effect. So there are many groups that we're members of, and some might allow us to have privilege, which means the people that are not in those groups do not get the natural automatic benefits that we receive just by sheer membership alone in that group. We've only touched on some of the many, many topics that are studied by social psychologists. On the slide are a few more examples, but again, still a partial list. If you find this area of psychology particularly interesting, perhaps you'd like to take social psychology. As I mentioned, if you're a psychology concentration person, you will be taking social psychology.